The MK.A Whippet was a groundbreaking medium tank developed by the British during World War I. Introduced in 1917, it was designed to complement the heavier tanks like the Mark IV, focusing on speed and manoeuvrability. With a top speed of around 8 miles per hour, the Whippet, named after the fast-running dog breed, was nimble for its time, allowing it to exploit breakthroughs in enemy lines. Equipped with 4 7.7mm Hotchkiss machine guns, it excelled in supporting infantry and harassing enemy positions. Unlike its heavier counterparts, the Whippet was lighter and more adaptable, making it perfect for quick attacks. Crews often used its speed to flank enemy troops and disrupt supply lines, proving effective during battles such as the pivotal Battle of Amiens in August 1918. In an engagement near Kashi, a Whippet company of 7 tanks wiped out 2 German infantry battalions caught in the open, killing or wounding over 400. That same day, 24th of April, one Whippet was destroyed by a German A7V in the world's second tank battle, the only time a Whippet fought an enemy tank. During the Battle of Amiens on August 8, 1918, the Whippets fought alongside Mark IV and V tanks, marking a critical moment described by German General Ludendorff as the Black Day of the German Army. The Whippet successfully penetrated German rear lines, leading to significant artillery losses and a major setback for the Germans. One Whippet, named Musical Box, ventured deep behind enemy lines and operated independently for 9 hours, destroying an artillery battery, an observation balloon, and a transport column, inflicting heavy casualties. However, it sustained damage when small arms fire ruptured fuel cans on its roof, forcing the crew to wear gas masks due to the fumes. However, the Whippet faced challenges, included limited armor protection and vulnerability on the battlefield, as well as a need for 2 crews, as the fumes and hot conditions inside the tank would cause a crew to need a day to recover. Despite this, it became a symbol of innovation in tank warfare. Ultimately, while only a small number were produced, the MK.A Whippet's design and tactics influenced future armoured vehicles. Today it stands as a testament to the evolution of military technology during one of history's most brutal conflicts. My name is Callum from Columbus Models, and today I'll be building the Meng MK.A Whippet in 1/35th scale. So first of all, to start the kit, we start with the upper hull superstructure. The Meng have done that in a way that it's multiple flat pieces that you bend together to try and form the shape around the lower bathtub hull. It is somewhat of a good idea, although trying to position and make sure everything fits right the first time can be a bit annoying. It has some minor interior details to install on the inside of the hull, mainly where the Hotchkiss machine guns go. They have ball mounts that you need to attach in. As you can see, I had a little bit of trouble trying to get it to fit. I think that's just because big hands, big fingers, no hand-eye coordination, most likely. Whole bunch of little outer things to be stuck to the outside. I'm not sure what they are, but I'm sure someone would like to inform me. Again, trying to get the shape of the upper hull is a little bit annoying just because it's all got to be on specific angles, so I'd suggest just putting glue on, dry fitting it, attaching it to the lower hull, making sure that it fits each time, because otherwise you'll see here the roof won't fit on properly. There's a whole bunch of small plates that you got to put on. If you don't get that main superstructure wall at the correct angles, nothing will fit and you stopped before you've started, really. So I would suggest just keep dry fitting, making sure it all fits, then gluing down a little bit at a time. Especially when the glue goes down, you have a bit of time just to massage the plastic around the place before it fully sets. And once you've put that together, you can attach it to the lower hull. And of course, with all kits like this, when you've got to build up multiple sections, dry fit as many times as you can, just because you know once you put the glue down, that's when you're going to have a problem. So dry fit 5, 6, 7 times, then glue it down. The lower hull now, you can add the floor plate that goes on. It's a lot of nice details on the floor plate, actually. A lot of raised rivets and stuff like that, which are one of the things that draw me towards World War I tanks, is that they just have so much surface detail. Up next, you put together the fuel tank for the engine. It's a petrol engine. And of course, in good old-fashioned World War I style, this fuel tank, goes on the front of the tank, and it's just got a little, maybe 14mm armored housing that goes on the that goes around the fuel tank. So I don't know how good of an idea this is. You know, the very first thing the enemy sees is a fuel tank filled with petrol. So I don't know, not something I would want. Up next, you're just attached, I believe these are air vents for the engines. I'm not too sure. In the real tank, you have 2 engines in the engine bay, similar to, I think they are double-deck bus engines on either side, similar to the Matilda 2. Just installing the Hotchkiss machine guns. Now, with all my machine guns, I don't like them to rotate, so I do glue them down. However, I did break them multiple times, so just be aware. Once the upper hull is finished, it's time to start working on the suspension. However, you'll see I'll build up one side of the suspension for you on camera, and I'm just going to speed through it. And with that, all the road wheels and return rollers and all that kind of fun stuff is all put together. I will have to say the road wheels are a bit of a pain in the ass because they have to go on a specific sort of pattern. Just because you have outer ones and inside ones and all sorts of things. But I will say that this whole sub-assembly just goes together so well. There's a little bit of, like, you can see with the return rollers, you got to get everything all nicely lined up before you put the last sort of faceplate onto it. But apart from that, there is absolutely no issues associated with this suspension whatsoever. So it does get a little bit tedious sometimes because you've got to do it twice, but it's not too bad. What I do like about the suspension attaching to the lower hull is they have some very big contact points for gluing down. So just using a whole bunch of icky sticky liquid cement here, the thicker kind that's good for large surfaces, and the suspension just pops onto the side very easily. I glued it all together so I could paint it all as one and blend everything together. So that's how I prefer to do these kind of tanks, is just glue it all together and paint it all as one. Makes life so much easier. And I also forgot to install this sort of guide rail for the return rollers when I was building the main suspension system. So yeah, don't forget that. Read the instructions, people. Up next are the tracks, and you have to cut every single one of these out of the sprues and try and clip them together. If you do it right, they should be workable, and they do clip together well, but don't try and force it because they do break very easily, and once you do that, well, they're pretty much next to useless unless you have a lot of super glue. So I preferred the tack-on ones for the tadpole I built, but these ones were okay apart from that. I will say that the number that they give you for the amount of links needed per side, you might need to remove one just because they give you about one extra, and it ends up with a little bit of track sag just along the front there. So, which these tracks for World War I tanks were pretty tight. So, but on the downside, it does make installing the tracks a lot more difficult. Very much that you'll dry fit multiple times, but then when it actually comes to gluing, then it decides not to glue down properly. So you will need to take your time with the tracks and not be too forceful, especially when gluing. Otherwise you'll probably glue down and then notice that certain tracks have popped out of the connectors, and yeah, it just doesn't end up for a good time. Since this is going to be going on a base, if I do have to remove a few tracks and then there was a gap in the bottom or something, then I'll just hide that using mud and stuff. But you can see here I used definitely miscounted and used way more track links than I should have, but it just means that you can pull off the ones that you don't need and clip them on. And yes, you do need to cover up the entire camera when you're doing this process. It's very, very important to do. But you can see just how flimsy these tracks are. I mean, they kept breaking on me all the time and losing connections and stuff like that. So yeah, you just have to be very, very, very patient with them. But in terms of detail, these tracks are very good. I mean, not that World War I tracks are very detailed to begin with, but these ones just they just have enough raise points and stuff like that just to make things a bit more interesting. And they're not rubber band tracks, so that's also a good point, because rubber band tracks, of course, especially around the ends of the tracks, they will flex and bend with the links, whereas these ones, they do keep that sort of steel plate going around a curve look, which is so much more appealing. So I spent way too much time just doing this dry fit, just trying to figure out how many links I need to make it properly tensioned, but also not wanting to snap itself. And you can see here, it's just, you just got to work with it a bit and eventually just massage everything around. It will eventually fit. Eventually. When I did come to gluing them down properly, I did have a few issues, because the minute you introduce CA glue into anything, you can dry fit something as many times as you want and it will work each time, but the minute CA glue, super glue, anything like that touches the part, suddenly they don't fit at all, and they'll, yeah, it just gives you a whole bunch of problems. It must be a curse or something, I don't know, but yeah, I spent a long time fiddling around with this, and these tracks were the very last part of the build process, so I did spend a bit of time just making sure they worked. So now the build is finished and we are all ready for painting. You will notice I did fill in a few gaps that I noticed creep in, and that was just with thin down Tamiya putty. Thin down just so it would fill in, but not need sanding too much. So it gives a little bit of cast textures. So for the Whippet, I'll be basing this one off the Caesar 2 that is in Bovington, which I got to see in real life. And so this one, you'll notice there's a lot of people that will paint a Whippet in a more green color, whereas in fact they were more of a brown green than a green brown, if you get what I mean. You'll see on the Meng box art it is very green, but Whippets are actually a more brown color, so that's what we're going to be going with on this one. And if you want more information on how World War I tanks are painted and the origins for it and where they went with it, I would go check out my buddy Bearded Veteran Creates, aka Mikey. He does a lot of World War I stuff and he's a very good mate of mine. He has a video all about World War I British tank paint schemes for modelers, so I highly encourage you to go check that out. Subscribe to him as well, he is a great mate of mine, and tell him I sent you. That would be great. First off, we needed a coat of primer just to unify everything and make sure paint sticks down to the plastic properly. This is AK grey primer. After that, I used a base coat using olive drab and a dark brown AK 3rd Gen acrylics, which I don't use a lot. I'm more of an enamel guy, but so this is just our flat base. And then I added in a little bit of light brown and filled in the centers of each panel just to create a little bit of shading. It looks a bit bad now, but when it dries and blends in, it will look a bit better. And it's just a subtle sort of post shading type thing. I did the same with my Mark IV Tadpole as well, but that was more of a green. But it's just with all these big panels that were quite flat, you just needed something just to break up the sort of monotony. So this is what the finished paint job looks like. Just change the light there. And you can see it's just subtle enough that you can see the individual panels and they don't sort of blend in with each other. You can see where the rivets are and stuff like that. And I think the rivets are what we're going to deal with next. And that's just adding in even more lighter brown and lighter green to the mixture and picking out every single rivet, raised detail, everything I can find on the Whippet, which some people have issues with because they get bored. I don't mind it too much just because, you know, I usually throw something on in the background and make a bit of an afternoon of it, so it's quite relaxing in a way. I really don't mind doing this sort of detail work on rivets and stuff like that. And after that, painted up the gun barrels on the Hotchkiss machine guns just using a gunmetal. Before I went on to doing the pin wash, I decided these exhaust pipes were usually wrapped with an asbestos cloth or something like that, and I decided after I put the exhaust on to try and replicate that detail. So using just a cotton string, I just used super glue to taper the end so I could push it through sort of like a needle, and just spent about 20 minutes wrapping around the exhaust, which is just a small detail, but I think it just works, makes it just seem a bit more realistic and just gives it a bit more detail to it, really. So So always keep an eye out for these sort of small details. And with any of the sort of fraying edges of the string, I just use a lighter to take them off. Unfortunately, I did melt the gun barrel. After that, I masked up the front so I could spray the tank regiment insignia on the nose. I do really like the British tank insignia with the red and white stripes. It's just something that strikes out a bit more in contrast with the sort of duller drabs of the main colours of the tank. So it just gives a nice sort of little detail to it, and it's quite satisfying as well. So just peeling off the mask now, and hopefully I didn't have too much bleed through, which is any that does go through is easily cleaned up anyway, so it's not too much of a worry, but I think I managed to do it fairly well this time. And just adding on the decals as well for Caesar 2. I also picked Caesar 2 because there is also Firefly in Belgium. However, the Meng model was modelled after Caesar 2, and one difference with that is you'll see my finger in the top left there. That panel line should have a line of rivets. Caesar 2 does not have that for some reason, whereas Firefly in Belgium does. So it's one thing you just need to keep an eye on. If you want to recreate Firefly, there's a line of rivets you need to install yourself. I don't know why it doesn't have those rivets, but just something to keep an eye out for. These decals went down really well, conformed to the panel lines and stuff really easily, and very little work. They were really good. After that, I mixed up a sort of dull grey metallic colour to spray the tracks with. That was after doing a AK light grey primer coat on them. There's just a base, so you don't have to get it exact, just because it will be weathered up next. And speaking of weathering, I mixed up a wash with enamel paint to go around every single little detail, and afterwards cleaning up with a bit of white spirits just to make it a bit more uniform, a bit more blended in, not so much stark contrast and stuff like that. But again, this was a nice afternoon working on it, and it was just quite pleasant and relaxing to do, really. I went with just a straight black wash for this, just because we do have a brown base coat and brown tones with the paint job, so I didn't want to have a brown wash to go with it, just because it would blend in a little bit too much. I do want a little bit of contrast between the rivet lines and panel lines and stuff like that, just to make it a little bit higher contrast, make it a bit more visually interesting, stuff like that. It might not be 100% realistic, but as long as it looks good, I'm okay with that. So you can see just wicking away any excess and blending it all in with some white spirits, usually terps for me, just because I use enamel paints a lot. It does make cleanup a lot better, and you can just sort of refine any sort of pin lines and stuff like that you put in, and yeah, it's just quite satisfying to do as well. So it's a good skill to have, and I just think it adds just a little bit more to your model than if you didn't do a step like this. After that, I went through with some more details, like these wooden shoes, I guess you could call them. I can't remember off the top of my head what they are. But basically you attach them to the tracks, and that gives you more traction. Normally would call them grousers, except they had a special name for these things. They're just metal brackets around a wooden plank, and you could attach them to the track, and you get a bit more traction with them. So these ones, since they are wood, I did my wood grain effect using acrylic paint and then oil on top, just to create some fake wood grain texture, and I think it just adds a little bit more detail, a little bit more visual interest to the model. And using black pigment powder to simulate exhaust stains along the edges of the exhaust and the areas around the exhaust, so panel lines, so the panels immediately adjacent to it. So this is the main paintwork for the Whippet done. This is it clean, but since this is going to be on a diorama base during the First World War, I will be making this muddy. I like to weather a tank first before making the terrain, just so I can match it up, and kind of gives me an idea on how I want the mud to work. But for now, I'm going to get straight on to how I muddy up a MK.A Whippet. So first I thin out a little bit of AK Mud Effects paste And using a toothpick, I start building up where large sort of deposits of mud would have sort of stuck onto the sides and gone down the sides of the suspension, especially along the front there. Using a toothpick, you can kind of form more hard-edged lines, which wet mud would have, but will be blended through later, as you'll see with pigment powder. But for now, just going around the whole edge and just covering up all the work I did, which seems like, you know, effort and futility, but hey, I mean, you got to start clean before you get muddy, and it just helps to build up things. So yeah, just using a toothpick to draw out sort of like an outline of how I'm going to weather it, and then just build upon it and just add layers and layers and layers. And then just blending with a brush just to remove some of the larger chunks as well. Just give it a bit more of a feathered look. And don't forget to add plenty of mud into the mud chutes, because, well, that's kind of what they're designed for. They collect mud from the tracks on the way back and deposit it down the chutes, keeping it well clear of anything else. So, yeah, plenty of mud in there. Don't be too scared. It is a World War I tank. They did get very muddy. And after that, going along the tops of the tracks that would be in the mud, of course. And this is just a first layer. As I said before, we're going to start building up layers and stuff. So don't be too scared with putting on too much paint, too much weathering effects, because you can dial it back. You can bring it back to a slightly less weathered state. It's just good to get it all on there, just in case you miss something. You don't want to have clean parts showing through your weathering. So after the mud effects is on, while it was still wet, I went through with a cotton earbud and wiped off all the raised areas, such as the teeth of the tracks, the rivets on the tracks, anywhere that mud wouldn't really stick to, just because it's in contact a lot, and also just brings through and makes it a bit less uniform, we'll say, with the mud on the track. Some of them I didn't clean off, some of them I did. You just got to try and keep it random. I know humans hate trying to make things random. We like patterns. But after this, I thinned down a whole lot of pigment powder in water and ran it through my airbrush just to give a more dusty effect, try and just blend things in, and don't have too many harsh edges, but also just to add in another type of mud, another type of weathering and stuff like that onto the existing layers. And if you're going to do this with pigment powder, please make sure you clean your airbrush thoroughly, otherwise it's not good for you. After that, I got a stiff head brush, dipped it in water, and ran it up and down to create more streaking effects. Sort of just blends in everything together, gives it a streaked effect, and keeps it on a slightly more wetter look than dry, because this is going to be on a muddy base, so most of the mud wouldn't have dried that quickly, but also just gives it a little bit more visual interest to the model. You don't want just monotone. With the tracks, I got a graphite pencil and ran along all the raised edges, just because the track points were usually quite clean, somewhat. I will be going back through and adding a bit more weathering to those, just so they're not absolutely sparkling, but I think it just gives a bit more detail, a bit more visual interest to the tracks themselves. You don't want tracks getting too boring. And then I went through with Tamiya's dark brown wash and just picked out random panels just to add in more wet look. And this is purely just to add some sort of randomness to the tracks. Some of them are slightly darker, some of them are slightly lighter. It just gives more sort of visual interest to the tracks. Because the tracks on a Whippet are quite prominent, they're a big feature on the tank, you probably want to spend a bit more time on it, just to give them a bit more detail. They're a big part of the tank, so don't skip out on them. Not like, say, something that's like you can only see 30% of the tracks because it's covered in side skirts, whereas a Whippet, yeah, they're quite prominent. But this was pretty much the last thing I had to do on the Whippet, was just the tracks for now, because it will be going on a base later. But if you're to have this as just a standalone, I think this would probably be enough weathering for you. So this is the sort of last thing we need to do before we go on to the reveal shots. And here we have the completed 35th scale Meng MK.A Whippet. I really enjoyed building this, and I hope you guys enjoyed watching it. I will be making a World War I diorama base type thing for this tank because it just seems a little bit lost and forlorn just sitting on a shelf by itself. At some point I did damage the barrels for the machine gun, so I will be 3D printing off some new ones to add to them, and I'll be adding stuff like stowage and other kind of stuff, but I usually do that stuff when I'm making the base. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the video and get inspired to make your own Meng MK.A Whippet, and until then I'll see you in the next video. Bye.